There is a particular kind of silence that isn't peaceful, and Steve Perry lived inside it for 27 years. The man with the most recognized voice in rock and roll chose that silence deliberately, walking away from Journey at the height of their fame and vanishing so completely that even people who loved him wondered if he'd ever existed the way they remembered. That question haunted millions of fans across decades while radio stations kept playing his songs and arenas kept filling with people who mouthed every word he'd written. Journey continued without him, cycling through replacement singers who chased something that couldn't be manufactured because what Perry carried wasn't technique or training. It was a kind of truth that either lives in a voice or doesn't. Somewhere between the sold-out stadiums, the relentless touring, and the woman he loved and eventually lost, that truth became too heavy to keep holding up in public, and Perry put it down. The voice, the fame, the music that had defined him since childhood in Hanford, California, all of it went quiet. What followed was more than 2 decades of near-total withdrawal from the industry he'd helped reshape, and the reason behind that withdrawal turns out to be far more layered than creative burnout or physical injury or any of the explanations that circulated for years. Growing up in Hanford, a small agricultural town in California's San Joaquin Valley, Perry absorbed music the way children absorb language, constantly and without effort. His mother sang. His father sang. The walls of their home carried Motown and gospel regularly, and that combination of raw emotional expression and technical discipline shaped Perry's instincts before he'd ever set foot on a stage. By the time he was a teenager, his voice had developed into something that stopped conversations mid-sentence, not through volume, but through the sheer weight of feeling behind each note. Every phrase arrived fully committed, and audiences responded to that commitment the same way people respond to anyone who means what they say. Journey found him in 1977, and the search that ended that day had lasted years. The band held technical skill in abundance, but lacked the one element that transforms skilled musicians into something people remember, which was a voice that could carry emotional weight at scale. Perry walked into that audition, and within 30 seconds, guitarist Neal Schon later recalled, nobody said a word. The answer was that obvious. Within a year of Perry joining, Journey sounded almost nothing like the band they'd been before, because the songs now had a soul that all the instrumental talent in the world couldn't have provided on its own. Their 1978 album Infinity introduced mainstream audiences to what Perry could do, and the response came fast, with the record selling over 1 million copies in its first year alone. Radio stations played the songs constantly. MTV, still finding its footing, featured their videos regularly. Perry's face became widely recognized, and with that recognition came the invisible machinery of expectation that would eventually grind him down. By 1981, when Escape arrived, Journey had crossed from successful into cultural phenomenon. Don't Stop Believing sold over 9 million copies in the United States, spent weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts, and embedded itself into the memory of an entire generation so permanently that decades later it still appears in films, television finales, and sporting events as shorthand for something that refuses to give up. The pressure that kind of success generates doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, and by the time Perry noticed how heavy everything had become, the weight had been building for years. Touring consumed 10 months out of every year. The simple life Perry had known in California, the backyard gatherings and Sunday dinners and evenings without an agenda, had been replaced entirely by hotel rooms and sound checks and the constant expectation that he would deliver perfection to a different city every night. His perfectionism compounded everything. Engineers who worked with him described recording sessions that stretched 12 hours or more, not because anything was technically wrong, but because Perry could hear a version of each song in his mind that he couldn't quite reach on tape. Vocals got redone 20, 30 times. The band would finish their parts and leave, and Perry stayed behind chasing a sound that existed only in his imagination, which is the kind of chase that never ends well. That's when Sherry Swafford came into his life. She worked as an esthetician in California, lived outside the music industry entirely, and showed no interest in the rock star version of the man pursuing her. What she wanted was Steve, the person underneath the performer, and for the first time in years that person felt real again when she was nearby. Their relationship stretched across the early part of the decade, complicated by absence and distance in the way that any relationship struggles when one person is constantly somewhere else. Perry wrote "Oh Sherry" for her in 1984, and the song carried the full weight of their story, the passion, the distance, the apology embedded in the melody. The music video showed them together and happy, but behind that image the relationship had already begun to fracture under the sustained pressure of his schedule and his absence. By 1986, it was over, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of too much time spent apart. And Perry absorbed that loss the way he absorbed everything, inward and private, armored by a smile that no longer quite connected to anything underneath it. A year after the breakup, he left Journey. The final show happened in Anchorage, Alaska on February 1st, 1987, and Perry walked off that stage, packed his bags, and within weeks had withdrawn from the industry so completely that the people who'd worked alongside him for a decade couldn't get him on the phone. No farewell concert, no press release, no explanation offered to the millions of fans who kept asking where he'd gone. What followed were more than 20 years of near-total silence from a man who had once been inescapable. Perry moved between small towns where anonymity was easier to maintain. He grew a beard, wore ordinary clothes, and navigated daily life as someone the public wasn't looking for. Music got cut out entirely, not as a casual lifestyle adjustment, but with the discipline of someone managing a condition. If a Journey song came on inside a restaurant, he stood up and walked outside and waited in the parking lot until it ended. A friend who witnessed one of those moments found Perry leaning against a car afterward, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Old performances couldn't be watched. Recordings couldn't be listened to. Every note opened a door he wasn't ready to go through, and behind every melody waited a version of his life he was still trying to survive. His mother called and begged him to just hum something, telling him he was born to sing, and Perry would smile and redirect the conversation. Even she couldn't reach the place where the music had gone. He attended several Journey concerts over the years, standing at the back of arenas among thousands of people who had no idea who was standing next to them. Watching his replacement perform the songs he'd written to crowds that still knew every word, Perry felt something closer to relief than resentment. Someone else carried the burden now. Someone else managed the expectations. He could breathe. That changed in 2011 when Perry met Dr. Kelly Nash at a cancer support group, a psychologist and breast cancer survivor. Kelly carried the specific kind of strength that comes from having already faced the worst and chosen to keep going anyway. Fame meant nothing to her, not out of indifference, but because she was interested in the person rather than the legend. Slowly and carefully, Perry let her see him, and what she found was a man who still had music running through him, whether he admitted it or not. She'd catch him humming in the kitchen and say nothing. She noticed him tapping rhythms on the steering wheel and let it go without comment. That patience, that willingness to let him come back to himself on his own terms, created the first safe conditions he'd experienced in years. They fell into something permanent and quiet, and for the first time since Sherry, Perry felt like himself around another person. Kelly's cancer returned, aggressive and fast-moving, and as her health declined, she took his hand and asked him to make a promise. "Don't disappear again," she told him, her voice weak, but her intention completely clear. "Promise me you'll sing. Promise me you won't hide anymore." Perry promised. He held her hand and meant every word. Kelly Nash died in December 2012, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence he'd ever lived inside. But something had shifted in the way he carried it. The loss broke him, the same as every previous loss had broken him. But this time when the breaking finished, he didn't run. Some months after Kelly died, Perry walked to his old record collection and pulled out a Journey album. His hands were shaking. The needle dropped onto Faithfully, and his own younger voice filled the room with words Jonathan Cain had written in 1983 on a tour bus between cities. Words about loving someone across an impossible distance, about staying faithful despite everything the road demanded. Perry had recorded that vocal on the third take, and everyone in the studio had applauded when it was done. Now, hearing it again after 27 years of avoidance, he felt every layer the song had ever carried. Sherry's face, Kelly's hand, the years of hiding, every promise made and every promise broken, including the ones made to himself. He sat in that chair and cried without performance or restraint, the way crying actually happens when something has been held back long enough. When the song ended, the room was quiet again, but this quiet felt full rather than empty, full of everything he'd been running from, and underneath all of that, something that registered clearly as hope. Perry crossed the room to the piano that had sat untouched for years, lifted the lid, and placed his fingers on the keys. One note sounded, uncertain and trembling and more alive than anything he'd heard since before the silence began. Another followed, then another, simple and searching, and more tears came, but different ones this time, not grief but recognition. The music had been there the whole time, waiting with the patient certainty that he'd eventually return. Traces arrived in 2018, Perry's first solo album in 24 years, and nothing about it resembled what anyone expected. No arena anthems, no attempts to reclaim commercial territory, no high notes deployed for effect. Songs like No Era Sin and No More Crying carried the weight of a life lived honestly and with difficulty, and his voice, softer now and weathered at the edges, carried that honesty directly into the listener. Critics acknowledged the craftsmanship, but fans heard something that went deeper than craft. They heard a man who had survived his own story and was finally ready to talk about it plainly. Social media filled with messages from people who had carried his music through their own difficult years and now wanted to return something of what they'd received. Perry made an unannounced appearance at a Journey concert, standing in the crowd as an ordinary audience member while thousands of people sang the words he'd written decades earlier back to a stage he was no longer standing on. Watching that moment, he cried again. Hearing those lyrics sung by that many people reminded him, he said afterward, why the music existed in the first place, not to be perfect, but to be true. At 75, Steve Perry performs rarely, and that's not a loss. The return to music was never about reclaiming anything. It was about the promise made to a woman who loved him enough to tell him what he needed to hear. It was about a song avoided for 27 years finally getting the confrontation it deserved. It was about a man finding his way back to the person he'd been before the machine of fame and expectation swallowed the original. Those years of silence weren't wasted. Perry has said plainly, every single one of them was necessary to become someone worth listening to again. Faithfully will carry Journey's name forever. But the song belongs equally to Perry's story, because the journey it describes was never only about life on the road. It was about staying true to yourself when every external force is pulling you in a different direction, about loving something so completely that even 27 years of silence can't kill it, and about the particular courage required to sit down in a quiet room, drop the needle on the record, and finally let the music find you again after all the running is done.